Hi everyone, my name is Jen Klump and I'm excited to talk to you today about preparing for interviews. My career is in higher education. I work currently at Marquette University in the College of Health Sciences. We're located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And throughout my career in higher education, I've worked with interviewing in a wide variety of ways. So as a supervisor, I hired dozens of student staff members. I sat on professional search committees to hire employees of the university. I worked in a career center for a period of time, and in the current work that I do, I help students who are pursuing things like medical or dental school get ready for the application process, and that usually involves an interview. So over all of those different settings, I've really developed a passion for interviewing and interview preparation because I think it's such a great opportunity for people to tell their story. And I think that they can be an intimidating process, but it's also something that if you prepare properly, I think you can really allow yourself to shine. So hopefully our time together will prepare you to do that today. So throughout our time together, what you will learn about me and my approach to interviewing is that I think that there's no perfect way to prepare for an interview or for all interview questions, but there are some principles that we can use to help us prepare. And my main principle that you'll hear me reference throughout our presentation today is that an interview is a conversation, it is not a presentation. So whether you're doing an interview for distinguished young women, or you're doing a job interview or a college admissions interview, or perhaps a professional school admissions interview at some point in time, it's really important that you consider an interview as a conversation, getting to know other people and helping them get to know you, versus a presentation where you're expected to be perfectly polished the entire time. I think that this takes a little bit of pressure off of the situation, which is helpful, and it really allows us to think about the purpose of an interview. So the purpose of an interview is for your interviewers to be able to determine at the end, are you a good fit for their organization, whether it is representing that organization, whether it's being admitted to it, or whether it is kind of working as part of that organization. And in order to do that, they need to know who you are. And so I think as you go into an interview, I would always ask you to think about it as that. You all are extraordinary young women who are able to share so many excellent things about yourselves in interviews. And I think that the more you think of it as a time to be able to do that and chat with other individuals, the better your prospects will be. So keeping that in mind, I think it's important to consider that if you are looking for the right answers to interview questions, you're actually asking the wrong question. I work with a lot of students who, like I said, are pursuing things like medical school or dental school. So they are exceptionally high achieving students who are used to being able to prepare for things like exams. And I think this is a wonderful life skill, obviously, but sometimes I think it hurts us when we're preparing for interviews because these students are used to being able to get it all right the first time. And in a conversation, that's actually not what happens all of the time. But if something happens where things go awry in a conversation, you're able to pick up and admit a mistake or move forward in a composed way. And ultimately, when you think about yourself as, a representative of distinguished young women, as a person in the workforce, as a student, that is a much more realistic experience or setting that you might find yourself in versus having a presentation that is fully polished all the time. And so we want you to think more about what are my values, what are my experiences, what's important to me, and who am I, and how can I communicate that to my interviewers, rather than having a perfectly prepared and polished answer to every single question you think might be thrown at you. Because spoiler alert, you'll probably get a question that you did not perfectly prepare for. And interviewers will be able to tell that you ardently prepared for this question and you had no idea this one was coming. But if you consider the whole thing a conversation where you know your deeply rooted values and beliefs and skills and experiences, and you're just communicating those as a human person having a conversation, then you don't get as thrown off when those kind of weird questions pop up. So what does this conversation look like? As you're going into any interview setting, I think it's really important to remember that while it is a conversation, we need to also be at our best. This is the best case scenario conversation. So we always want to be positive and professional throughout an interview experience. I think there are a few elements that really play into this. The first is that in terms of being positive and professional, it's important to really communicate your passion for whatever position it is that you're interviewing for. So whether it is a job interview, a distinguished young women interview, a college admissions interview, it's important that you communicate your passion for whatever organization that you are trying to become a part of. Remember that your interviewers are in some way, shape, or form part of that organization. And so you share that with each other. And so I think the more that you can communicate your passion and excitement, the more excited they are going to be about the prospect of working with or having you as a representative of that organization that they presumably are also proud to be a part of. It's really important to consider that the entire experience is an interview. So some people say, from the moment you walk into a room, you should be on. It should be interview time. I would go a step further and say that really the moment that you set foot in kind of a setting overall, you're starting your interview. So if you're going to, let's say, a job interview, the moment you get out of your car or you step off of the bus or however you got there, that's when your interview starts. It's really important to remember that, again, we're trying to find out, is this person going to be a good fit for our organization? Are they someone we'd be proud to have represent this organization? And so that doesn't just happen in that formal interview setting. It's important that we, are people of integrity and that we are acting the same way outside of that interview as we are inside that interview. So I think being mindful of that can just be important depending on the setting and how long you have before you're in that actual formal interview process. I also think that humility goes a long way in an interviewing process, which I think seems a little counterintuitive sometimes because we are told we need to go in and we need to sell ourselves or sell our experiences. But I think humility is an important part of that. As I think about who are the people I would want to be my coworkers or my supervisees or a person representing my organization, I think someone who's humble and recognizes that they do have awesome strengths, but they also are human, is kind of the type of person that I would want to have on my team. And so as you're thinking about interviewing, you know that you have so many excellent skills and abilities and experiences, but you also know that so does everyone else, presumably, who's interviewing. And so much of an interview is about fit. And so I think being humble and recognizing that you're bringing a lot to the table, but that you also could have a lot to learn, is a really great just attitude to bring with you. Similarly, I think remaining curious about others can be a really important part of an interview. I think that so many people go into an interview assuming they just have to talk about themselves the whole time. And sometimes in some interview settings, that is more true. In some settings, like a job interview, for instance, you may actually find yourself being asked things like, do you have any questions for us? Or what do you want to know about our organization? And I think that having some questions prepared about your interviewers, perhaps about the organization or about the role that you would play, can be a really great way to demonstrate the curiosity that you have, which then also demonstrates the enthusiasm you have about that program or organization. So I think that even if you feel like you know a lot about the organization already, we can always ask our interviewers their own opinions about things or their own best experiences in certain situations. And so I think the more that you can remember that a conversation is not only natural, but it's also two-sided, the better, because that can lead to kind of a more authentic conversation. And then lastly, as you think about being positive and professional, I think it's important to recognize that there are some situations that may have been really powerful that we may want to talk about in an interview setting, but that may have negative emotions associated with them. So maybe it was a really challenging situation you went through, a traumatic experience you went through, a situation you went through that made you angry. And sometimes these are the situations that we learn the most from. But I think it's important to recognize that in an interview setting, again, we want to be positive, we want to be professional. And so if you do find that you want to talk about a negative experience that might have some negative emotion with it, I would make sure that that's one of the things that you practice a lot ahead of time so that you become comfortable talking about it and might not get yourself tripped up in a sticky situation in an actual interview. I think showing emotion in an interview can be appropriate depending on what you're talking about or what question you're answering. But I also know that displaying emotion in interviews often is something that throws people off internally. And so I always think preparing to really be your best in an interview is the best way to go. And so I think practice, which we'll talk a lot more about moving forward, is one of the best ways to do that. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about some common types of interview questions that you may run into and some ways that you can prepare for them ahead of time. So first up, let's tackle those traditional questions. So these are the kind of questions that if you were to Google interview questions, these types of things might come up. Ironically, I think that these are some of the most difficult questions, even though they sometimes appear the simplest. And I think no question exemplifies that more than tell me about yourself. I think this is meant really by most interviewers to be a pretty easy softball question where you just get to warm up and talk about yourself a little bit. But I will say that nearly every single person I've ever worked on interview prep with has said that this is the question that makes their mind go blank. They're like, I don't know. Who am I? What have I done? Why am I here? I don't know anything anymore. And I think it's because our brain is just overwhelmed with, well, what do you want to know? There's so much about me. I'm so multifaceted. What could I possibly tell you that would answer this question? And so I think that if you can prepare a bit ahead of time, it can be really helpful because it can help give you some guideposts as you answer that question. I would never advise you, however, to have a prepared statement that you recite about this question. Because again, an interview is a conversation. And if you ran into, an old family friend, let's say, while walking through your neighborhood, and they had someone with them that you'd never met before, and that person just said, oh, hi, nice to meet you. Tell me a little bit about yourself. You wouldn't launch into a recited elevator pitch of who you are. You would just tell them whatever seems appropriate in that context. And so I would think similarly about a tell me about yourself question in an interview context. What is the thing that you want them to walk away remembering about you? If they were deliberating between you and a couple other people and they were asking themselves, okay, Jen, which one was she again? What are the kind of things that you might want them to know? Also, this is usually the first question you get asked, and there are going to be more questions for you to share about yourself. So you do not need to tell them your whole life story in this answer. I especially don't recommend starting this answer with, well, I was born, because ultimately we know everyone was born. And usually, unless you maybe were born somewhere that is, a really important part of your story that relates to this position that you're going for, or unless it really ties into what you want to talk about in this interview, it's really kind of starting at the beginning of life, and then it gives you a lot of room to have to catch up to present day. And so I always say that it's important to think about, what are the things that are most important for them to walk away with? And if you need a framework, I find that sometimes using something like present, past, future can be helpful. At least having those three building blocks in place. I think the order of present, past, future works well for a lot of people, but you could flip it around if that made sense for you. So what would that look like? When I work with students who want to apply to medical school, let's say, here is what that might look like. So my name is Jen Klump. I'm currently a senior at Marquette University studying biomedical sciences with a minor in neuroscience. I'm really interested in becoming a physician because when I was 12, my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and I was able to see how the doctors cared for her and really were able to come up with a plan that not only helped her go into remission, but also allowed her to really be empowered in her journey of her cancer diagnosis. And I really want to be able to do that for others. So I'm applying to medical school so that hopefully I can become an oncologist someday, because I'd really like to be able to make an impact in the world the way that my mom's doctors did on my life. So you can see how that is a pretty short version of what is likely a much, much longer story, but it gives some little tidbits that will allow your interviewers to know a bit more about you. I sometimes use the analogy of a movie trailer for this question. So when you watch a trailer for a movie, you know enough about it to be interested and to maybe have some questions and want to learn more, but you don't know the whole plot. And so I think sometimes that can be a nice framework to use. But like I said, at the end of the day, if you need some guideposts, maybe an opening statement and a closing statement, that can be helpful, but I wouldn't make this something that is really scripted. Okay, let's move on to strengths and weaknesses. So this is an area that gets really commonly asked in job interviews. Basically, I think it's important to balance that confidence and humility in this situation. So the confidence comes in with our strengths, right? We want to be proud of our strengths and we want to tell our interviewer what our strengths are, as well as perhaps an example of how we have demonstrated them. If you think about it, anyone can say strengths, right? Anyone can say, I am really organized, I am really driven, I am really empathetic, but not everyone can necessarily give examples of those. So if you're able to perhaps give an example, I think it rounds it out and helps your interviewer know a little bit more about you as a human versus just knowing some nice words to say about yourself. For weaknesses, I think it's important to recognize that this is a place to demonstrate that humility, to recognize that you are a human being, you do have weaknesses, but that you are working to overcome or compensate for those weaknesses. And so I think, again, it's important to not just answer with the weakness, but then a little bit more context that helps them understand how that would not be a liability if they were to bring you on into their organization. I would say in most interviews, you will be asked something like, why do you want this position? I think that it's really important that you remember that this is a time that you can express your values and your skills and how they align with the position. So I would not just focus on the position itself, but rather you and how you can really tie into that position. I also think that when we look at things like current events and issues, a lot of people feel like there's a lot of pressure on that. Feels like maybe it's a pop quiz and you may or may not know the answer to it. I think doing some preparation work to make sure that you feel confident about these going into an interview is really important. But I also think that it's important, again, to be humble and confident at the same time in a question that's asked about current events or issues. So if you are asked your opinion about something, it is okay to have an opinion. I think that it is fair to share what your opinion is, perhaps to acknowledge that there are others with conflicting opinions on it. And then if you're not really well educated about a situation, please own that. So again, in a conversation, I don't want to talk to somebody who is just making stuff up about an issue that I've asked them about. I want to hear somebody say, you know what, that's actually not something I've read much about, but it sounds really interesting and like it would relate to what I'm interested in, blah, blah, blah. So I think that acknowledging when you don't know something is a-okay, but hopefully you're able to do some research up front, especially about the things that really align with what you're passionate about. Because I think in a lot of ways, this question gets asked in order to give you kind of a platform to share more about your values or your opinions, specifically about things that relate to perhaps the job, perhaps things that you've stated in your resume or your application materials that you're interested in. So again, I would not look at this as a teacher giving you a pop quiz, but rather a person in conversation just trying to learn more about you. All right, so a bit more of a complicated type of question is what we call a behavioral-based question. These are questions that start with something like, tell me about a time that you, and I think that these can be challenging because the question itself says, tell me about a time that you did X. And so many people focus their answer on telling the person about that time. And sometimes they can get really hung up on what they did, or not even what they did, but what the situation was, and spend less time communicating about themselves and how they showed up in that situation and what that would mean for them as a representative of this new organization moving forward. So I have two little tricks that I think can be helpful when you get asked a question like this to make sure that you make this answer about you and not about a past situation. The first is called the STAR method. So you'll see that on the screen here. It's a situation, a task, an action, and a result. So if you were asked a question like, tell me about a time that you had to work with someone who had different opinions than you, I might answer that question like this. I'll walk you through those stages. When I was in graduate school, I had a supervisor leave at mid-semester and a new supervisor was hired on who was doing things really differently than our former supervisor did. And a lot of the staff members that worked for me were really upset with the new direction that things were taking. I summarized the situation in a pretty succinct way. So I could tell you a lot more about that situation, but the description of the situation really shouldn't take more than like 20% of your answer. So moving on, I would go on to say something like, I recognized that as someone who was supervising part of this staff, I needed to have a conversation with my new supervisor to get on the same page about what her expectations were for the team moving forward. I quickly summarized what I needed to do in that situation. And then next up, I explained my action. I asked her if we could sit down together and go over her list of priorities for the team and what I thought the list of priorities for the team were so that we could compare and contrast those and come up with a shared understanding of what we were supposed to do. So here's where I really highlight my own action in the situation, how I took that task and made it mine. And then lastly, I would conclude by saying something along the lines of, afterwards, there were still times where the team was confused about what priorities were, but I felt like I had really opened up the lines of communication between myself and my supervisor. And so moving forward, even when we ran into tricky times, we had an easier job or an easier time getting on the same page moving forward. So as I summarized that result, I really connected those dots for that interviewer. I kind of handed them on a plate, here are the ways that my skills helped me in this situation, and the implication is that is the kind of thing that I'll be able to do if I'm representing your organization in the future. Now, I know that STAR is a pretty quick acronym, but sometimes I think it's a little too complicated to think about in the heat of a moment in an interview. So I also like something called Driscoll's method of reflection. This is actually used more for reflecting on experiences like service trips or study abroad opportunities, things where people have really important experiences that they need to unpack. But I think it's helpful in interviews too. So the general framework is super simple. What? So what? Now what? So the what is basically the situation in the STAR method. So what's the answer to the question? What is the time you can tell me about? The so what is about, okay, so what happened and what did you do in that kind of time? And then the now what is basically looking at what's this going to mean for you moving forward? And I think what I love about Driscoll's method of reflection so much is that in the heat of a moment, if you are answering a behavioral-based question and you find that you've been rambling on for a while, because that happens especially in these kind of questions, you can just say to yourself in your head, so what? Or now what? And that can jog your memory to say, okay, time to transition away from that situational description and into what this means for me moving forward. Because ultimately, the point of a behavior-based question is to learn more about you as a person and what you're going to do in your future position, not what you did in that past position. So as I mentioned earlier, in these kind of questions, it's really time for you to connect the dots for your interviewer. Typically, when you're in an interview process, they will be interviewing lots of other people, perhaps in that same day. And they probably have a lot of information about you already from the materials that you provided ahead of time. And so what can be really helpful is taking some of that intellectual work off of the shoulders of your interviewer and helping them connect what you've done and what experiences you've had to the kind of person that you are. And so I think more important than really getting the answer right, so to speak, is being able to communicate your values and your priorities and how they showed up in the past and how they'll show up in the future. So I always encourage people to do some brainstorming ahead of time. I typically call it a brain dump. Like, just think about what are all the experiences that you've had that really stick out to you as things that you might want to talk about in an interview, and write those down on paper. Just give yourself a set time, like maybe set a timer for 5 minutes and just jot down everything that comes to mind. Then set another timer for about 5 minutes and do some thinking about, what does this organization care about? What are the values that Distinguished Young Women stands for? What are the values that this job stands for? What does this college that I'm applying to care about? And once you have those two lists, you can start to make some connections. So if an institution cares a lot about social justice, okay, what are maybe some experiences that I've had that demonstrate my commitment to helping people that are different from me? And so you can start to kind of look at, okay, here's my bank of experiences that I'm creating some mental files of. And then in an interview setting, you know, if a question about social justice were to come up, you can essentially look in that section of your file folder and you can say, oh, okay, found it. Here's the experience I want to talk about. And by brainstorming it and preparing it ahead of time, you've kind of created a system that you can go back in and look at, versus in the heat of the moment thinking, okay, I have 17, 18, 19 years of experience. I'm sure I had a time that relates to this, but I just can't think of a specific example. So spending some time to brainstorm those specific examples up front, I think can really pay off moving forward in the future. So our last type of question is a hypothetical or situational question. So these are questions like, tell me what you would do if. And so as we're thinking through these questions, again, sometimes this can feel like another pop quiz that's happening. And it's important to step back and think about, what's the purpose of them asking me a question where they're saying, what would you do? And I think when you really step back and think about it, there's a couple different things they're looking for. They're looking for you to demonstrate your ability to be a critical thinker. They're looking perhaps for your ability to see multiple sides of an issue. And they're looking for your ability to think on your feet. These are all really important skills when it comes to just being a human in the world, and especially being, a great representative of an organization. And so I think that instead of really putting a lot of pressure on yourself to have the exact right answer in one of these hypothetical or situational situations, I think you need to think again about communicating those values that you have. So how do those show up in these situations? So I would never advise you to answer a question with just a definitive one sentence, here's what I would do. I would say a little bit more about why that is the answer that you have. I also think this is a really common kind of question where you might get a follow-up question from an interviewer. And I think sometimes this can feel really intimidating because the follow-up question kind of implies that you didn't do a good enough job answering the question the first time. But know that, again, if the purpose of this question is for them to see you think on your feet, to analyze a situation, to critically think, asking you a follow-up question and throwing it out there is really giving you another opportunity to demonstrate all of those things. So if you're asked a follow-up question, roll with it and answer it honestly, knowing that it's not an attack on your original answer, but just a great new opportunity for you to share more about what you're thinking. If you are truly unsure of how to respond to a situational question, or really any question, I think a couple seconds of silence is appropriate as you gather your thoughts. We don't want you to just start talking and see what comes out, because that usually doesn't have great results. But if you can just take a moment to gather your thoughts and then begin to speak, I think that that is a-okay. If you truly are unsure of how to start, I think that if all else fails, you could say something like, some things I would be thinking about include. So maybe walking them through your thought process and just kind of narrating that process in your head versus feeling like you just are coming out swinging with a hard answer if you truly do not have a good hard answer on the tip of your tongue. And so, maybe an example of that would be sometimes students are asked a question in a professional school interview setting about, what would you do if a classmate of yours tells you that they have the answers to one of the upcoming exams and they want to know if you'd like a copy of them? If you're really not sure how to answer that question, you could say something like, some things I would be thinking about include, number one, integrity is really important to me, and I do not want to be caught in a compromising situation, and so I will absolutely not take those answers from my friend. However, I'm also uncomfortable that I know this is happening now, even if I'm not taking the actual answers myself. And so I'd be thinking about, do I need to tell someone that my friend did this? Do I need to ask my friend to turn themselves in? And so I think the more I think about it, it would be important to me that I notify someone that this happened. So I think I'd give my friend an opportunity to come clean and tell them herself. But ultimately, if she did not do that, I would need to tell my teacher, because it would be unfair to others in the class as well as myself if these answers continued to circulate, as well as my friend who wouldn't actually be getting the learning that she needed from that situation. So that's just a way that you could talk through it if you were not quite sure how to answer that question, but demonstrate that you're able to look at those multiple sides of a situation and ultimately come to a conclusion that you feel comfortable with. All right, so we've made it through the nitty-gritty of the types of questions. Now I want to talk about just preparing in the way that works best for you. We know that that really looks different for everyone. So I would ask yourself some questions about, how can I be my best self at this interview? What sets me up to feel my best? When I took the ACT, or I took a really hard AP test, or I had to go give a speech, what did I do that prepared me well, that made me feel really good going into it? How can I do those things? So was it a specific amount of sleep that I got? Was it, a big breakfast with lots of protein? Was it listening to certain music on my way there? Were there things I did that did not work out for me, and how can I make sure to not do those? Really, I think developing a plan for feeling your best the day of your interview helps you go into it with confidence and really start out on a good foot, which is important. And then I think there are some more specific things that you can do to really prepare to be your best, whatever that looks like for you. The number one thing that I suggest to everyone is to practice out loud, both with other people and recording yourself. This is so awkward, and I know that, but the thing is, I'd rather you have an awkward experience in the privacy of your home, recording yourself on your phone or with a trusted friend, than in the actual high stakes interview. And so the more that you practice out loud, the more practiced you are going to be with answering questions on the fly. So I talk to so many students who spend a ton of time writing out their answers to questions or thinking through answers in their head, and they have really beautifully crafted answers that do not sound natural when they're speaking them out loud. And so I think that practicing out loud takes you away from that scripting, that reciting, and moves you into that more conversational flow. I think that when you record yourself and you watch yourself back, you're able to catch a lot of mannerisms or different methods of speaking that might be distracting. I know when I watch this back later, I'm going to probably notice my hands moving a lot, which can be okay as long as it looks natural and isn't overtaking things, and saying kind of a lot. You may have caught that actually as well. It's something that I work on when I'm doing public speaking, and you're never going to be able to fully eradicate it, but you may be able to work on it once you know that information. I think that when you think about preparing ahead of time, I would also really caution against over preparing for questions that you're nervous about. So it sounds counterintuitive. It's important to practice questions that you're nervous about, but I would not practice it in a way that basically gives you a script that you feel like you need to follow. Because the moment you deviate from that script in the actual interview setting, you are going to feel thrown off your game, and that is going to really lead to a cascade of not feeling great. And so I think it's important that you practice in multiple ways and multiple settings, and remember that you're just trying to get a point across. You're not trying to get the perfect words across. I think that there are a lot of things that lead to anxiety in interviews, so managing nerves is always very important. So I have two main tips that students have really appreciated throughout the years. Box breathing is one, and power posing is the other. So I hope that you've heard of these, but if not, let's go through them really quickly. So box breathing is a method of basically managing the cortisol levels in your body through your breath. So this is something that you can do really privately, which is great. Even if you're in a crowded room, you can do this and people don't know that you're doing it. It's great before something like an exam, a big race. I actually use it on airplanes when there's turbulence and I'm feeling a little nervous. And actually, there are people in the special forces of the military who are trained in this because they obviously go into very anxiety-producing situations. So the basic idea is that in your mind, you're picturing creating a box or a square. And so as you're breathing in certain ways, you're kind of moving along the side of the box. So you're going to, if you want to do it with me now, if you want to breathe in for a count of 5, hold your breath for a count of 5, breathe out for a count of 5, and then hold your breath for a count of 5. So if you go in, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, 3, 4, 5, out, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, 3, 4, 5, and repeat that cycle hopefully 3 to 5 times, starts to be enough that your body is really starting to regulate its nervous system. So this is an excellent trick that you can put into practice in a lot of different places. I've heard many people doing this before going into an interview just as a way of calming and centering themselves. Power posing is a little more overt, probably not something you're going to do in a crowded room unless you are just one of those extremely confident individuals who's willing to do this. But the idea behind power posing is that you are going to be striking a posture that is going to basically trick your body into feeling like you are in charge and in a power position. And so that can look like standing in like a star pose, so with your legs spread out a little bit on the ground and then your arms up to either side, or maybe a Superman pose, so again, legs spread out a bit, and then your hands on your hips, chest up straight, looking confident. Basically, picture a situation where you're just taking up a lot of space and looking confident. And the idea is if we hold this pose for a minute or two, we trick our body into believing that we feel this powerful, even if we're really, really scared. So that is a method that there is some research that suggests it works. There's some that suggests it doesn't. I always say, find what works for you. See if you feel better after you do it. If you do, cool. I've known many people who have done this in bathroom stalls prior to interviews because it's a little awkward to do it in a waiting room situation. But finding what works for you to manage those nerves is really important. It may not be either of these things, but if they help, then take them with you. And the last thing I want to talk about in terms of preparing to be your best is to dress for success. I know that the Distinguished Young Women program has, great guidelines for you about how you should be dressing for those interviews. I think in general, there are two main concepts that I think are important no matter what kind of interview setting you're going into. So the first is really to just avoid distracting items. So you'll see that most interview advice tells you to wear things that aren't super flashy, that don't really distract people, not a lot of perfume, not big jewelry. I would never wear these earrings to an interview because they are giant and flashy, and I don't want people to be sitting around and saying like, okay, Jen, which one was she? Oh, she was the one with the giant gold earrings. So in this situation, I'm not doing an interview, I'm doing a presentation, so it's a little bit different. But basically making sure that the things that you are wearing are not going to be distracting and be the thing that you get remembered for. So usually that looks like really kind of toning down what you're wearing so that what shines through is you and your answers and not what you're wearing. I also think it's really important to test your outfit for your interview in every single posture you can possibly imagine being in when you are at your interview. So typically, I don't know about you, but when I'm in a dressing room at a store, I try on the clothes, I look at myself in the mirror standing up, and I decide whether or not to buy them. But for an interview, it is so important that you practice all the different postures you may be in. So can you sit down? Can you stand back up? Can you drop something on the ground and pick it up? Can you do all of these things without something funky happen? Can you reach across a table for something? Can you do all these things without having issues with something, stretching too much or ripping or showing something that you didn't mean to show? It's just really important to know that you're not going to have to think about that when you go into the interview, that you know for a fact that that's not going to be something that has to be on your mind. Same goes with shoes. So if you're doing an interview where you know you're going to be standing or walking for an extended period of time, it's really important that you test those shoes ahead of time in the environment that you'll be wearing them. So if you know you have to stand for a certain amount of time, you need to stand for that certain amount of time before your interview in your shoes. If you know you're going to have to, let's say you're at a college interview and you're going to have to walk across campus with someone, can you walk a certain distance in these shoes? I had a student once who was preparing for a medical school interview come to a mock interview with me in my office, which was maybe 2 blocks from her apartment. And by the time she got to my office, the new shoes she had purchased for her interview had already made blisters that had broken on her feet. And so luckily, it stunk that she had to have blisters, but luckily she knew then, okay, these are not the shoes that I'm going to wear to my interview. I know I have to pick something that is more trustworthy and comfortable. And so good that she learned that ahead of time versus having to, hobble around through her interview at a day-long medical school interview. So all in all, I think the idea of preparing to be your best really means that you are preparing in a way that you can go into that interview with communicating your excellent experiences, your excellent skills, your really well-known values is the thing that's on your mind, and not what you look like or how you've prepared or what is going to be happening. But I think doing all that preparation up front really lets you focus on what is the most important to you and what's the most important to communicate in that interview setting. And there we have it. At the end of the day, the interview process is really about communicating who you are, what you've done, and why you would be an excellent addition to any organization. So I hope that our time together has helped you reflect on yourself a bit, has given you some tips and tricks to use moving forward, whether it is in the coming week or the coming years. And ultimately, just remember that an interview is a conversation where you get to share all of your amazing accomplishments and learn about another person. And so I hope that as you take that into the future, it is helpful and that you have much success moving forward. Take care.